What if I told you that Charles Leclerc's best time on the third day of the second week in Bahrain was not what impacted Ferrari the most, but what the hidden data behind that lap revealed? Because while the stopwatch placed Leclerc at the top of the table, inside the box the reaction was not immediate euphoria. It was silence. It was analysis. It was a surprise. Frédéric Vasseur and Lewis Hamilton were seeing something they did not expect to see so soon. The SF-26 had a much higher performance ceiling than the simulations indicated, but also a technical fragility that could turn it into an unstoppable weapon or a car that was extremely delicate to explode. On that third day, it was not just a fast lap. It was about discovering that when everything is aligned with hybrid power, engine braking, aerodynamic balance, and tire management, the Ferrari can sustain rhythms that completely change the narrative of the season. And that left Vasseur with a raised eyebrow, and Hamilton understanding that the real challenge is not to go fast, but to unlock that potential without breaking the balance. Today we are going to analyze what exactly surprised Ferrari in the second week of Bahrain, what the comparative data between Hamilton and Leclerc really showed, and why that best time could be much more important than it seems at first glance. On the third day of the second week in Bahrain, something happened that completely changed the internal conversation at Ferrari. Until then, the work had been methodical, almost cold. Correlation tests, progressive balance adjustments, race simulations to understand how the SF-26 reacted in varying conditions. But when Charles Leclerc set the best time of the day, the focus was no longer solely on the timesheets and went directly to the telemetry monitors. Because that lap was not only fast, it was revealing. During the morning, Leclerc worked with a configuration that sought to stabilize the front axle at corner entry without compromising traction at exit. The car looked settled, with a more stable aerodynamic platform than in previous days. The temperature of the asphalt helped, yes, but what really caught the attention was how the Ferrari maintained consistency in the microsectors. There were no exaggerated peaks or abrupt losses. It was a clean, progressive, controlled performance. And when the fastest lap that put it at the top of the day was completed, the message was clear. The car has real speed. However, the real impact came when these data were compared with the long runs that Lewis Hamilton had done. Because while Leclerc was validating the potential on a lap, Hamilton was exploring the limit in simulated race conditions. And then something unexpected appeared. At certain moments of the stint, when the seven-time champion found the exact combination between hybrid power delivery, engine brake management, and aerodynamic load point, the SF-26 did not show the drop in performance that is traditionally expected in long runs with a high level of degradation. The cliff just didn't come. That disconcerted Vasseur, because the internal model projected a more pronounced degradation under that level of demand. But on the track, with proper management, the car maintained rhythms that placed it in a very serious competitive range. He wasn't just fast on the first turn thrown, could repeat times within a narrow window for several consecutive laps. And that was not completely planned. The surprise, then, was not that Leclerc was the fastest of the day. It was understanding that the roof of the car was higher than estimated, but it depended on extreme precision. Hamilton was demonstrating that small adjustments in the way he braked, in the way weight was transferred to the front axle at corner entry, could stabilize the car without punishing the rear tire. That is, performance was not locked by design. It was conditioned by execution. When engineers dig deeper into the comparative telemetry between Leclerc and Hamilton, the real heart of the matter appears. The SF-26 has an extremely sensitive operating window. It is not a car that tolerates wide deviations in mechanical balance or energy management. It works like a precision instrument. If the hybrid delivery is anticipated a few tenths before the optimal rotation of the car, the rear axle begins to slip more than expected. If the engine brake does not accompany the weight transfer in the initial phase of the curve, the nose loses that anchor point that stabilizes the aerodynamic platform. And that is where Hamilton begins to make a difference in the long runs. Not because it is faster in absolute terms, but because it is capable of modulating micro-adjustments lap after lap. The data shows how it slightly modifies the braking point when it detects the beginning of graining, how it adjusts the progression of the pedal so as not to saturate the front tire, and how it manages the electrical energy to avoid delivery peaks that break traction in slow corners. They are details invisible from the outside, but decisive in consistency. Leclerc, for his part, shows that when the car is in the ideal window, he can squeeze the most out of it in a fast lap. His best time was no coincidence. It was the result of a perfect alignment between tire temperature, effective downforce, and battery status. But when analyzing the longer stints, Ferrari detects something key. Maintaining that balance requires pinpoint discipline. The car does not correct excesses easily. It does not forgive slightly aggressive inputs or early overloads of the rear axle. This is where Vasseur begins to understand the real dimension of the challenge. The ceiling is very high, yes. The numbers confirm it. But stability on that roof is not guaranteed. The SF-26 has the potential to dominate a session if everything clicks, but it can also drop half a second if the tire's thermal window moves just a few degrees or if the energy management is not perfectly synchronized with the track. In the internal analysis of that third day, Ferrari identifies 3 critical variables that determine performance: the stability of the aerodynamic platform at corner entry, the thermal management of the rear tire in traction, and the progressiveness of hybrid delivery in low-speed areas. When those 3 are coordinated, the car transforms. When one fails, performance drops sharply. And that explains the mix of enthusiasm and caution within the box. Because for the first time in Bahrain's second week, the data not only shows competitiveness. They show that the Ferrari can operate in a range that puts it at the highest level. But they also reveal that this competitiveness depends more on the pilot than in other recent concepts. The car is not designed to be forgiving. It is designed to be exploited with surgical precision. Vasseur understands that the discovery is not only technical, it is strategic. If the car has such a high roof, the development approach changes completely. It's no longer about looking for more downforce or more hybrid power. It is about expanding the operating window to ensure that performance does not depend on perfect execution lap after lap. Because in classification you can afford a surgical turn. In racing, you need repetition under pressure, traffic, thermal variation, and high fuel. The Bahrain analysis makes it clear that the SF-26 responds in an extraordinary way when the front balance is perfectly established and the electrical energy is progressively released in the traction phase. But it also shows that small deviations multiply rear wear and generate instability in the platform. That, transferred to a real Grand Prix, can mean losing pace in the last 10 laps of a stint or being forced to advance a strategic stop. This is where Hamilton takes on a fundamental role, because its ability to read degradation in real time and adjust steering can become a development tool. He's not just driving the car, he's teaching the team how to hold it at the limit. His long runs in the second week were not simply pace tests, they were comprehension sessions. And Ferrari detects that this experience may be the key to domesticating the concept. Leclerc, for his part, has already shown that the peak exists. His best time on the third day validates that the car can be placed in the absolute benchmark when everything falls into place. But the challenge now is to integrate both dimensions, the one-round attack and sustained management. If Ferrari manages to combine the explosiveness of qualifying with the stability that Hamilton began to hint at in the long run, the competitive landscape changes radically. The second week in Bahrain did not define championships, but it did leave a powerful internal conclusion. The potential is there. It's real. The data confirms it. Now the question is not if the Ferrari can be the fastest. The question is if they can do it consistently when the traffic lights go out and there is no longer room for experiments. The conclusion of everything that happened on the third day of the second week in Bahrain is not summed up in a better time on the table. It is summarized in an internal revelation. Ferrari discovered that the SF-26 is not limited by a lack of performance, but by the difficulty of holding it within an extremely precise window. And that completely changes the reading of the project. Leclerc confirmed that the peak exists. His return was not a coincidence or an isolated coup d'effect. It was validation that, when the car enters the correct zone of temperature, balance, and energy delivery, it can be placed as an absolute reference. But the real discovery was parallel. Hamilton demonstrated that this performance can also be maintained in long runs if managed with surgical precision. It is not a forgiving car. It is a car that demands deep understanding. Vasseur understood at that moment that Ferrari did not need to revolutionize the concept. You need to tame it. You need to expand that operating window so that performance doesn't depend on perfect execution every time you go out on the track. Because in testing you can find the ideal point. In the race, the environment is constantly changing. And that is where it will be decided whether this potential turns into mastery or frustration. The second week in Bahrain made something very clear inside the red box. The ceiling of the SF-26 is higher than what they themselves had projected. But it is also more fragile. And that duality will be what sets the course for the start of the season. If they manage to stabilize that platform and replicate what was seen on that third day, Ferrari will not only be in the fight, it could set the pace. If they don't achieve this, we will see a brilliant car at times, but vulnerable when conditions are not perfect. Vasseur and Hamilton's surprise was not emotional, it was technical. It was the moment when the data said something different than what they expected. And in Formula One, when data changes the narrative, everything can change afterwards. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.